She walked into every room, as if she had already won. That was the thing about Emily Brooks, not the tailored charcoal blazer she wore on Tuesday mornings, not the headline on the cover of Forbes that called her the most decisive mind in American finance, and not the corner office on the 32nd floor of Brooks Capital's downtown tower, where the glass stretched floor to ceiling, and the city spread below, like a map she had personally drawn. It was the certainty, a bone-deep, practiced, almost surgical certainty, that she understood people the moment she laid eyes on them. 38 years old. Self-made in the truest and most grueling sense of that word, Emily had built Brooks Capital from a single conference room in a rented office building into a $2.4 billion investment firm with clients on 4 continents. She had done it through intelligence, through relentless work, and through a talent for reading situations and people faster than anyone else in the room. She had made it a personal philosophy, nearly a religion. The first impression was the only impression that mattered, because in her experience, people almost never surprised her. Her team at Brooks Capital revered her the way people revere something that is both admirable and slightly terrifying. Her executive assistant, Jenna, kept a running mental list of the things that made Emily's right eyebrow rise by exactly 1/4 of an inch, that subtle, silent signal that someone had failed her expectations. Junior analysts rehearsed their presentations in the bathroom mirrors of the office. Senior partners, men and women who had survived 2 recessions and 3 market crashes, still straightened their collars before walking into her conference room. Emily was not cruel. She was never petty, but she operated at a frequency that left little room for error. And the people around her had learned, sometimes painfully, to match that frequency or find somewhere else to work. She had earned her edge, and she wore it without apology. In financial circles, in boardrooms, from Manhattan to Chicago to San Francisco, her name carried a specific gravity. When Emily Brooks committed capital to a deal, other investors followed. When she walked away from one, the room reconsidered. She had become, without entirely meaning to, a signal in the market, a single human data point, that other sophisticated players watched the way traders watched the yield curve. What very few people knew, what Emily herself rarely examined, was that her certainty about first impressions had been forged not in boardrooms, but in poverty. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in the south side of Chicago, the daughter of a hospital janitor and a woman who worked the night shift at a 24-hour diner. She had worn secondhand clothes to school and carried a lunch bag that she held low at her side so no one would see how small it was. She remembered with precise, uncomfortable clarity the way teachers at her middle school had looked at her, that quick, involuntary glance that took in her shoes, her backpack, her neighborhood, and calibrated their expectations downward. She had spent the better part of her adolescence burning with something that was equal parts shame and fury. And she had channeled every degree of that fuel into becoming someone that no one would ever look past again. She had studied economics on scholarship at Northwestern. She had worked 16-hour days at a Chicago investment firm through her mid-20s, then founded Brooks Capital at 31 with 2 partners and a business plan she had rewritten 11 times. And somewhere in the climb, quietly, without her noticing, she had absorbed the very habit that had wounded her as a child. She had begun to read people the same way she had once been read, by their surface. She told herself it was efficiency. She told herself it was pattern recognition, that decades of interacting with hundreds of clients and executives and dealmakers had given her a calibrated eye. She used the language of intelligence to describe what was, at its root, something much older and much simpler. And for years, for most of her adult life, nothing had happened to tell her she was wrong. His name was David Cooper. And on the morning that everything changed, he was sitting in the cab of a 9-year-old Silverado pickup in the parking lot of a Kroger, trying to reach his daughter's pediatrician before the school day started. Sophie was 8 years old and had been complaining about her stomach since the previous evening, a low, persistent ache that she described with great seriousness as feeling like there was a rock in there that's rolling around. David had pressed her forehead with the back of his hand, the way his mother had once pressed his, found no fever, and decided to wait until morning. But morning had arrived with Sophie pale-faced at the breakfast table, pushing her scrambled eggs around the plate with the mechanical disinterest of someone performing a task they had been assigned. And David had put the eggs in the refrigerator and told her she could skip the eggs today. He was 42 years old, and he had the particular competence of a man who has been doing everything alone for a long time, the kind of competence that is not graceful or effortless, but simply unrelenting, because there is no one to hand the next problem to. He cooked every meal. He signed every permission slip. He drove Sophie to school at 7:45 each morning and picked her up at 3:15. And in between, he worked, and in the evenings he helped with homework and read aloud and made sure the night light in her room was on before he went to bed himself. To anyone watching from the outside, David looked like what the outside would naturally assume. A working man of modest means, moving through a modest life. His truck had 112,000 miles on it, and a dent above the rear left wheel well that he had been meaning to fix for 2 years. His work boots were Carhartt, worn to a comfortable softness at the toes. His jeans were the kind sold in 3-packs. On this particular morning he was wearing a flannel shirt in faded blue plaid clean. Because he was always clean, because there was a daughter watching, and his hands on the steering wheel showed the story of his days in a way his face did not. Calloused, slightly rough at the knuckles, the hands of someone who worked outdoors in variable weather. He had dark hair shot through with early gray at the temples, and gray-green eyes that were steady in a way that people sometimes found slightly unreadable. He was not a man who performed his emotions for an audience. He had learned, in the years since his wife died, to hold his feelings at a depth that was sufficient for functioning. And he functioned well. He grieved still, privately, on specific dates: Margaret's birthday in April, the anniversary of her diagnosis in September. But he had built a life around Sophie that was not defined by absence, even though absence was always present, the way a missing wall in a house still shapes the rooms that remain. Margaret had been gone for 5 years. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in the spring, gone by the following February. She had been 36 years old. David had sat with her through every hour of it, the surgeries, the treatments, the long nights in hospital rooms where the only sound was machinery. And in those months he had come to understand something about time and money, and the fundamental absurdity of accumulating one while the other ran out. He had money. He had substantial, almost surreal quantities of money, the result of 15 years of work in the technology sector that had ended in an acquisition that most people in his former industry still talked about. But in the months of Margaret's illness, none of it had purchased one additional morning. Not one more cup of coffee at the kitchen table. Not one more night with her asleep beside him. He had never been a man who performed his wealth. Had never owned anything that announced its price. But after Margaret died, he had retreated from the world that valued those announcements so completely that he had essentially vanished from it. He had declined board invitations. He had stopped answering calls from people whose interest in him was calibrated to the size of his bank account. He had moved with Sophie to a quieter neighborhood in a mid-sized city where nobody knew what he had done or who he was, and he had lived the life he wanted to live, which was a small, honest, warm life organized entirely around a little girl who liked astronomy and was allergic to strawberries, and still, sometimes, in the middle of the night, padded down the hallway to his room and climbed into his bed without saying a word. The occasional call from his attorney, Michael Ostrander, still found him estate matters, trust distributions, the administrative machinery of wealth that runs whether you attend to it or not. Envelopes from private banking divisions and wealth management firms still arrived at his house with the quiet formality of communications between institutions. David dealt with them when they required dealing with, and otherwise left them in a folder in his desk drawer. On the morning in question, one such piece of business needed attending to. A trust account, one of several that held portions of his assets, required his in-person verification and a signature to authorize a distribution. It was routine paperwork, the kind of thing that would take 20 minutes. And he had planned to drop Sophie at school before handling it. But Sophie's stomach had other plans, and by the time he had settled her into the passenger seat with a small bottle of ginger ale and a reassurance that they would stop at the bank first and then go directly to the doctor if she was still feeling bad. The morning had taken on the gentle, slightly worried texture of all mornings when your child is unwell, and you are the only person in the world who is going to fix it. The Meridian Trust building occupied half a city block in the financial district. All glass and pale stone, and the kind of architectural confidence that communicates permanence. Emily Brooks arrived at 8:52 in the back of a black Escalade. Her phone already open to the term sheet for the Hartfield acquisition, a $340 million infrastructure deal that her team had spent 6 weeks structuring, and that was now, finally, in its closing stages. She was in the building for a signing ceremony, the formal conclusion of the deal, the kind of moment that got photographed for press releases and corporate histories. And then she had a lunch with 2 pension fund managers from Boston who were considering allocating a portion of their capital to a Brooks fund. It was a full, clean, productive morning, the kind Emily liked. She moved through the lobby with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned to treat architecture as weather ambient, navigable, ultimately irrelevant to the work. The Meridian branch manager, a nervous, impeccably dressed man named Gerald Holt, met her at the private client entrance and escorted her to the executive suite on the second floor, where the papers were laid out on a long conference table and a junior partner from her legal team was already seated and waiting. Emily set down her bag, accepted the coffee that was offered, and began to review the documents. She was 3 pages in when she heard the sound from the main banking floor below, not a commotion exactly, but a kind of hesitancy in the normal ambient noise, the particular quality of silence that occurs when a crowd is collectively trying to be less noticeable. She did not look up immediately. She made a note in the margin of the term sheet, turned a page, made another note. Then she heard the child's voice, a small, patient, slightly discomforted voice saying, "Baba, my tummy still hurts," and something in her registered it involuntarily, the way you register the sound of a song from a specific year of your life. She looked through the glass partition that ran along one side of the executive suite and looked down at the main floor of the branch, where the regular business of the morning was proceeding at the normal measured pace of a financial institution on a weekday. And there, at the end of the row of service windows, stood a man in a faded blue flannel shirt, holding a numbered ticket and resting one hand on the shoulder of a small girl who was leaning against his side with the boneless, absolute trust of a child who knows that the person next to them is the safest place in the world. Emily's assessment was instantaneous and, she believed, accurate. The man was a laborer. The clothes said so. The truck, she could see through the lobby's glass front, pulled up to the curb in the loading zone with its dented wheel well, and its work permit sticker on the rear bumper confirmed it. He had brought his child to the bank, which in itself was not a problem. Parents brought children places. That was simply a fact of the world, but the way he was standing there, patient and unhurried, while the queue behind him shifted with the subtle impatience of people who had somewhere to be, struck her as oblivious to context. This was a financial institution. There was a rhythm to mornings in financial institutions, a shared understanding of time that everyone present subscribed to, and this man seemed either unaware of it or indifferent to it, and Emily was not sure which was worse. She set her pen down and told Gerald Holt that she was going to stretch her legs for a moment before the signing. Gerald nodded with the particular eagerness of a man who is professionally obligated to agree with everything. She came downstairs. She did not approach the man directly. She positioned herself at the edge of the main floor, near the cluster of leather chairs in the waiting area, and accepted a glass of water from a young staff member who materialized at her elbow with the reflexive hospitality that senior bank employees learn to perform around recognizable clients. She watched. The man was speaking quietly to the teller, a young woman named Priya, who was visibly trying to appear helpful while appearing uncertain about what she was looking at. He was asking, in a calm and specific way, about verification procedures for a trust account. Priya was typing. The little girl beside him had pressed herself against his ribs and was counting the tiles on the floor with her eyes. Emily felt a familiar, habitual assessment crystallizing into certainty. She could see, clearly, that whatever business this man had here was consuming time that the other clients in line did not have to spare. and that he appeared either unaware of this, or she thought again indifferent. She stepped forward. It was not a large step, not a dramatic one. She simply moved into the line of sight between the man and the teller, with the easy authority of someone accustomed to having space made for them, and she spoke. Her voice was pleasant and controlled, the voice she used in boardrooms when she needed to make a correction without making it a confrontation. She said that large transactions and trust verifications typically required dedicated appointments rather than walk-in service windows, that they tended to hold up processing for other clients, and that someone at the private client desk would be happy to schedule something at a more appropriate time. She smiled when she said it. She meant for it to be helpful. Around her, the main floor of the Meridian branch became very still, that specific stillness that occurs when a large number of people simultaneously decide not to look at what they are looking at. Priya at the window had stopped typing. Gerald Holt, who had followed Emily downstairs and was now standing 7 feet behind her with the expression of a man watching something irreversible unfold in slow motion, had gone slightly gray. David Cooper looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at weather, not with hostility, not with confusion, simply with the patient attention of someone registering information. He did not raise his voice. He did not flush or bristle or arrange his face into the defensive mask that people put on when they feel they are being dismissed. He just looked at her, quietly, for a moment. Then he looked back at Priya and said, gently, that he appreciated the suggestion, but that he had spoken with the private client team the previous afternoon, and they had confirmed that in-branch verification was appropriate for this particular account, and he wondered if it would be possible to proceed when she had a moment. Sophie, still pressed against his side, looked up at Emily with the wide, uncomplicated curiosity of an 8-year-old who is not yet old enough to know that she should look away. Emily held her ground for a moment. The still air of the banking floor held its breath. Then she stepped back, and whatever she had intended to accomplish she left unfinished on the tile floor between them, and the morning continued. What happened next took approximately 4 minutes and 30 seconds. And it rearranged everything. Priya had resumed typing after a moment, her fingers slightly more deliberate than they had been before. The way fingers move when the person attached to them is thinking about something other than the keys. She had entered the account identification number that David had provided on a small folded slip of paper, and the system had requested a secondary verification code, which he had provided from his phone, and then the system had processed. And then the screen had done what screens do when they return a result, which is simply display it, indifferently, the way all large truths are delivered without ceremony or warning. Priya looked at her screen. She looked at it for what was probably 3 seconds but felt longer to everyone watching. She looked at it the way you look at something that you are not entirely sure you are reading correctly. Then she looked at David. Then she looked back at the screen. The number displayed in the account summary field was $503,827,000. The account designation read, Priority Tier 1, the Meridian Trust's highest client classification, reserved for fewer than 15 account holders in the entire country, a tier with its own dedicated relationship team, its own direct line to the bank's senior partners, its own floor in the building. There was a small gold icon next to the account holder's name that Priya had only ever seen twice before in 3 years at Meridian, and both previous times it had appeared on screens in the training videos they showed during onboarding as an example of what exceptional service scenarios looked like. The teller 2 windows down had glanced over and gone still. The young staff member who had handed Emily the water glass was standing 4 feet away holding an empty tray, and not appearing to remember that she was holding it. Gerald Holt, behind Emily, said something under his breath that was not quite a word. The woman in the queue behind David, who had been checking her phone with the muted impatience of a person who has 12 things to do before noon, looked up and read the room and very quietly tucked her phone back in her purse. Sophie, unaware of the meaning of any of it, had begun drawing figure eights on the back of her father's hand with her finger and was humming something tuneless and content. Emily stood perfectly still. She had the particular experience, in that moment, of watching a certainty dissolve not dramatically, not with the sharp crack of something breaking, but with the slow, irreversible quality of something becoming transparent, losing its density, revealing the space behind it where she had assumed there was nothing. She had assessed this man in under 10 seconds. She had acted on that assessment with the confidence of someone who has been right so many times that the possibility of being wrong has become theoretical, abstract, something that happens to other people who lack her calibration. And she had been wrong in the most public way available to her, in front of her branch manager, in front of a teller, in front of clients, in front of a little girl counting figure eights, and the wrongness was not a small technical error, but a complete and fundamental misreading, the kind that does not leave room for reinterpretation or graceful recovery. Gerald Holt appeared at her shoulder with the subdued urgency of a man who has decided that the most useful thing he can do is manage the temperature of the next few minutes. He spoke quietly to David, in a register that was entirely different from the register the morning had used, until now deferential, warm, apologetic before any apology had been spoken. He asked if they might move to the private client suite, if Mr. Cooper would like a more comfortable space for Sophie, if there was anything they could bring her for her stomach. David thanked him. He said ginger ale would be great if they had it. He lifted Sophie easily onto his hip, despite being in jeans and flannel on a tile floor, in a financial institution that had just discovered who he was, and he followed Gerald with the same unhurried, unperformed ease with which he had stood at the window 9 minutes ago, and he did not look back at Emily as he walked. The story of who David Cooper actually was came to Emily in fragments over the course of the following 2 hours. Assembled from Gerald Holt's whispered briefing in the corridor, outside the executive suite, from what she knew or could recall, and from a single long conversation with Marcus Webb, her own head of due diligence at Brooks Capital, who had answered his phone on the second ring and said, without preamble, "Oh, Cooper. Yeah, we tried to get a meeting with him 4 years ago. He's the one who built Helix." She stood at the window of the conference room where the Hartfield papers still waited, unsigned, and she looked down at the city below, and she let the pieces arrange themselves. 15 years earlier, David Cooper had been 27 years old, with a computer science degree from the University of Michigan, a rented garage in Ann Arbor, and an idea for an AI-driven logistics optimization system that the shipping and supply chain industries had not yet imagined they needed. He had spent 3 years building it with 2 friends from college, had been turned down by 14 venture capital firms, had maxed out a credit card, and borrowed money from his parents, and eaten peanut butter sandwiches for months because they were cheap and filling and did not require much time to make. His first institutional client had been a mid-sized freight company in Ohio that had given him a 6-month trial contract worth $40,000, an amount that felt, at the time, like a number from a dream. 3 years after that, the system had expanded to 62 enterprise clients. 5 years after that, Helix AI had been acquired by a German industrial conglomerate in a deal valued at $1.8 billion. David's personal stake in the company at the time of acquisition had been after employee equity pools, investor dilution, and various restructuring transactions, substantial enough that the phrase life-changing money was not adequate to describe it. It was more like category-changing money, civilizational shift money. He had been 37 years old when the deal closed. Margaret had already been sick for 8 months by then. He had signed the acquisition documents in a glass-walled conference room in Frankfurt while she was in a hospital bed in Ann Arbor, and he had flown back the same night and sat beside her, and held her hand and told her it was done, and she had said, in the measured, tired voice of someone who was no longer wasting words, "Good. Now you don't have to worry about that anymore." He had thought, in the strange, quiet logic of that moment, that she meant the company, the deal, the years of financial uncertainty. Later, he understood that she had meant something larger than that she was telling him that the worry she was releasing him from was something beyond money, something about the way people get locked into chasing things that turn out not to be the thing. She had been right, the way she was usually right, and he had spent the 5 years since her death trying to live at the level of clarity she had been pointing toward. He had not been hiding his wealth, exactly. He simply had not performed it. He drove an old truck because the truck ran perfectly well, and he had not needed to think about his truck in years, which was all he required of a truck. He wore work clothes because he spent considerable time outdoors, and work clothes were designed for that. He did not have staff or a driver or a professionally styled wardrobe, because none of those things added anything to the life he was actually living, which was a life organized around Sophie's homework and Sophie's soccer games, and the sound of Sophie laughing in the next room, and the specific, irreplaceable weight of her asleep against his shoulder, on the couch on Friday nights. He was not making a statement with his simplicity. He was not performing virtue or modesty, or any of the other qualities that wealthy people sometimes perform as a kind of second-order luxury. He was simply living, and the world, as it so often does, had looked at the surface of his living and drawn its conclusions. And he had largely stopped caring what those conclusions were. Until this morning, they had cost him nothing. Emily found him in the private client lounge on the second floor, where Sophie was asleep in a wide leather chair, with her feet tucked underneath her, and a half-empty ginger ale on the table beside her, and a Meridian Trust blanket pulled up to her shoulders by a father who, as far as Emily could determine, had spent the last 40 minutes conducting his banking business in a low voice so as not to wake her. He was standing at the window with his phone, reviewing something, when Emily appeared in the doorway. He looked up, he did not look away, and he did not look at her with the expression she had been bracing herself for the satisfaction of vindication, the raised eyebrow of someone who has been waiting to be recognized. He just looked at her with those steady gray-green eyes and waited. She had rehearsed, in the elevator, several versions of what she wanted to say. Most of them were inadequate. The most honest version was also the most uncomfortable, which she took as a sign that it was probably the right one. She came into the room. She kept her voice low, because of the child sleeping in the chair. She said, without preamble or softening, "I was wrong about you this morning. I made an assumption based on how you looked, and I acted on it publicly, and I am sorry." She paused. She had more to say, but she stopped there first, because she had found over the years that people sometimes needed a beat of silence to absorb an apology before they were ready to hear what came after it. David was quiet for a moment. He looked at Sophie, still asleep, her face smoothed into the perfect, unanswerable peace of a sleeping child. Then he looked back at Emily. He said, "I appreciate you saying that. Not thank you. Not it's fine. It happens. Not the automatic social lubricant that people deploy to make the person who has wronged them feel better faster. Just, I appreciate you saying that. The precision of it, the small, clean acknowledgement that did not forgive on command, but did not withhold recognition. Either landed in Emily's chest, with a weight she had not expected. She asked if she could sit for a moment. He nodded. She sat in the chair across from Sophie's, and she set her hands in her lap and she said, because she was not in the habit of leaving important things half-finished, "How are you not angry with me?" He thought about it. Not performatively, not the theatrical pause of someone constructing an answer for effect, but in the way of someone who genuinely wants to give you the accurate answer rather than the convenient one. Then he said, "I used to be about things like this. When I was building the company, and we were broke, and I'd walk into meetings and watch people decide in about 10 seconds that we weren't worth their time, I used to be angry about that. Took up a lot of room." He glanced at Sophie again. "Somewhere along the way I realized that carrying it was costing me more than letting it go. Not because those people didn't deserve to be wrong, they did, but because the anger was mine to carry, not theirs, and I had too many other things I wanted to carry." He stopped. He seemed to consider whether there was more to say, and decide that there wasn't. Emily sat with that for a moment. Outside the window of the lounge, the city was doing its ordinary mid-morning business cars, pedestrians, the small and relentless choreography of people moving through their days. She thought, with a clarity that felt slightly uncomfortable in its directness, about the girl she had been on the south side of Chicago, the one who had walked into rooms and felt the weight of other people's quick assessments, who had built the whole architecture of her adult life, partly in response to what it had felt like to be read at a glance and found insufficient. She had climbed out of that experience and carried the wound of it across 2 decades, and somewhere in the carrying she had set down the memory of the wound and picked up the habit that made it. She had become, without ever deciding to, the thing she had run from. The recognition was not comfortable. But it was clear, and Emily Brooks had spent her entire adult life doing uncomfortable things clearly. And she was not going to stop now. She asked him, after a silence that felt earned rather than awkward, how he managed it, the daily weight of being a single parent, the specific demands of raising a child alone. He talked about Sophie in the easy, detailed way of a man for whom that subject is the most interesting one available. He talked about her obsession with the moon, how she had a star chart on her bedroom wall and had correctly identified 3 constellations the previous summer while they were camping in Vermont. He talked about the way she ate breakfast, with great focused seriousness, as if the consumption of cereal were a task with important downstream consequences. He talked about how she had her mother's laugh, not just the sound of it, but the specific quality of it, the way it arrived without warning and meant something. He talked about her in the way that people talk about the things they love when they are not trying to impress anyone, which is to say with a plainness that is more moving than eloquence. Emily listened. She listened in the way she rarely listened to people, not processing and categorizing and preparing her next assessment, but actually receiving what was being said. He talked about Margaret too, briefly, not with the performed grief of someone who wants credit for surviving loss, but with the straightforward honesty of a man who has made peace with something enormous, without pretending it is smaller than it is. He said that what the illness had taken from him, in the end, was his certainty that effort and resources were sufficient. His confidence that if you were smart enough and worked hard enough and had enough of the right things, you could control the outcomes that mattered. He said he had not become a fatalist about it. He still worked. He still planned. He still put the ginger ale in the car before Sophie needed it. But he had stopped confusing the management of circumstances for the meaning of them. The value of a person, he said, not looking at Emily but at his daughter's sleeping face, isn't in what they're wearing or what they're carrying or what their number looks like on a screen. It's in how they treat people when there's nothing to gain from it. I've been in rooms full of people with very impressive numbers on their screens, and here the faintest trace of something dry and unsentimental moved across his expression, and some of them were the loneliest and most frightened people I've ever met. And I've met people who had almost nothing who were completely at home in the world. There isn't a formula. But the closest thing I've found to one is just treat people as if they matter before you have evidence that they do. Emily looked at him for a long moment. The morning had rearranged itself around her in a way she was still processing the documents on the conference table upstairs. The press release her communications team would send out this afternoon about the Hartfield deal, the lunch with the pension fund managers, all of it continuing on its tracks, exactly as planned. And here, in this quiet room, a man in a flannel shirt holding nothing more valuable than his daughter's borrowed blanket had said something that she knew, with the certainty she usually reserved for financial models, she would be thinking about for a very long time. The Hartfield deal closed that afternoon, as planned. Emily sat at the conference table and signed her name on the last page of a set of documents that represented hundreds of millions of dollars of value and months of meticulous work, and she accepted the congratulations of her team and of Gerald Holt, who had recovered most of his color by then. And she drank the champagne that someone had arranged to be chilled and waiting in the private suite. She was present for all of it. She performed none of it. On the drive back to the Brooks Capital Tower, she sat with her phone in her lap, rather than open on the term sheet for the next deal. And she watched the city pass outside the window, and she thought, the months that followed were not dramatic. Real change rarely is. It does not arrive in a single moment of revelation and then stand fully formed, ready for press coverage. It accumulates, the way sediment accumulates, in layers too thin to notice until one day the landscape has shifted, and you realize it did not happen all at once. Emily began by doing something small. She stopped using the phrase, first impressions in internal meetings. She did not announce the change, did not circulate a memo. She simply noticed when the phrase was rising in her, and set it aside. Then she began to ask different questions in performance reviews, not about presentation, not about the impression an employee made, but about what they had built and who they had helped and what problems they had solved that no one had assigned them. She found, in the asking, that she knew less about the people who worked for her than she had believed. She found talent in places she had been systematically not looking. She found a junior analyst in the quantitative risk team who had been flagged twice in previous reviews for communication style, but who had quietly identified 3 portfolio vulnerabilities over the previous year that the senior partners had missed entirely. His name was Jerome Carter, and he became, 6 months later, the youngest vice president in the history of Brooks Capital. She restructured the company's HR policies to remove provisions that she recognized, in retrospect, as dressed-up versions of the same surface assessment she had performed in that banking hall policies that had rewarded presentation over substance, style over judgment, the performance of competence over its actual exercise. She launched a program for employees managing serious family obligations, single parents, caregivers, people with children with medical needs that provided flexible scheduling and supplemental support. And she funded it directly from her own salary adjustment, rather than from the operating budget, because she wanted it to cost her something personally, the way important things should. Her team noticed the changes. They noticed in the way that employees notice when a leader changes cautiously, with the calibrated attention of people who have learned that institutional culture is its own kind of weather, capable of reversing without warning. But the changes held. They accumulated, and over time, the culture of Brooks Capital began to shift in the direction of its leader, as cultures do. She reached out to David Cooper 6 weeks after the morning at Meridian Trust, through Michael Ostrander, his attorney, who passed the message along without editorializing. She was not asking for a business meeting. She was not trying to recruit him to a board, or propose a deal, or leverage the connection in any of the ways her professional instincts would have managed it. She sent a note, handwritten, that said she had thought about what he had said in the lounge and that it had changed some things she was doing, and she thought he deserved to know that. She did not expect a response. He called 3 days later. Sophie was in the background. They were in the car. She could hear the radio, and he said that he was glad and that he hoped the changes were good ones, and asked how she was. It was not a conversation about money or business. It lasted 12 minutes. It was, in its plainness and its directness, one of the more nourishing conversations she had had in years. 12 months after that morning at Meridian Trust, Emily Brooks held her company's annual leadership conference at the Whitmore Center downtown, a gathering of 340 executives, clients, investors, and senior staff, the kind of event that came with live-streamed keynotes and catered breakfasts and name badges on lanyards and the particular self-congratulatory energy of industry gatherings. Emily had spoken at these events for a decade and a half. She had been photographed for them, quoted by the financial press about them, had her remarks excerpted in business journals, and passed around in email chains with subject lines like, "Thoughts on this?" She was comfortable on a stage in the way that she was comfortable in most of the spaces her career had placed her. She had always known what she wanted to say before she got there. This year was different. She had declined to prepare remarks. Instead, she had asked David Cooper if he and Sophie would come. And he had said that Sophie had a soccer game in the morning, but they could be there by 1 o'clock, and Emily had said that 1 o'clock was fine. She had arranged seats for them in the 3rd row, which made Gerald Holt, who was seated 2 rows behind them, and who would spend the rest of that afternoon telling the story of the Meridian Trust morning to anyone who would listen, visibly emotional, in a way that he managed with the professionalism of a man who has worked in private banking for 23 years. She stood at the podium at 1:15 in the afternoon and looked out at 340 people who expected to hear about market conditions, portfolio performance, the strategic direction of Brooks Capital into the next fiscal cycle. She could see David in the 3rd row, in a clean dark jacket he had clearly put on over the flannel shirt. She could see the collar because he owned the jacket, and this was a formal event, and that was the appropriate thing to wear. Sophie was beside him in a blue dress, her dark hair in 2 uneven braids that her father had clearly done himself that morning, and she was eating a program as a fan, because the main hall was warm and she was 8 years old, and a program is a perfectly reasonable fan. Emily said, "I want to tell you about the best lesson I received in my career. It did not come from a business school or a board meeting or a competitor or a mentor. It came from a man I insulted in a bank. She paused. She watched the room settle. 340 people became very still, in the particular way of an audience that has realized the speaker is going to say something true. I looked at him, and I saw what I expected to see. I acted on what I saw, and I was wrong in every single direction. She did not name the account. She did not name the number. She did not say the words $500 million, or trust account, or priority tier 1. Because those words were not the lesson, and she had learned, in the months since that morning, to be very precise about where the lesson actually was. She talked about what it had meant to grow up being assessed at a glance, and what it had cost her to absorb that habit and carry it forward, and what she had lost in the years of looking at surfaces and calling it judgment. She talked about what it means to build a company, any company, on the actual substance of the people in it, on their capability, and their character, and their care for the work, rather than on the efficient packaging of those qualities into forms that a hurried observer could process in under 10 seconds. She said that she had run Brooks Capital on the assumption that she understood people quickly, and that the assumption was not entirely false. She was a good reader of certain things, but that it had functioned as a lid, holding down the full height of what was possible, and that she had spent the last 12 months trying to take the lid off. She did not look at David when she said any of this. She did not need to. She was talking to the room, to the 340 people who spent their professional lives making assessments about other people, evaluating talent and risk and potential and worth. She was talking to herself, at 38, sitting in a conference room at Meridian Trust, certain of something she had not bothered to examine. She was talking to herself at 12, in a second-hand coat in the hallway of a Chicago middle school, learning what it felt like to be reduced. She was talking to all of the moments in between, when she had been the one doing the reducing, without hearing the sound of it. When she finished, the room applauded. It was not the polished, reflexive applause of an audience responding to a keynote. It was the quieter, more considered applause of people who have heard something that sits differently than they expected. Emily stepped back from the podium and looked out at the room and then, for the first time, looked directly at the third row. David was clapping with the rest of them, with the same unhurried ease with which he did most things. Sophie, next to him, had stopped fanning herself with the program and was watching Emily with wide, interested eyes, the way children watch adults when they can tell that something important is happening even without understanding precisely what. Then Sophie stood up. Not dramatically, she simply unfolded herself from the seat the way 8-year-olds do. All sudden angles and energy, and moved to the end of the row and walked up to the stage with the complete unself-consciousness of someone who has not yet learned that stages are for specific people at specific moments. David watched her go without calling her back. Because he had learned, in 8 years of her, that she was not a child who needed to be called back from things that were simply kind, Sophie reached the edge of the stage and looked up at Emily and opened her arms. And Emily, who had not cried in a professional setting since she was 26 years old, and received the phone call that her first institutional investor had agreed to fund her, came down from the podium and knelt on the stage floor, in a designer blazer that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment, and she held that child. And the room let it happen. And then it applauded again. And this time, the sound was different, fuller, warmer. The sound of something being recognized rather than performed. David stood and joined them at the edge of the stage. And the three of them, a 42-year-old man in a flannel shirt collar and a dark jacket, an 8-year-old in uneven braids, and a woman who ran a $2.4 billion company kneeling on a stage in front of 340 people, stood together for a moment in the particular light of a clear afternoon, and all three of them were smiling. And it was the kind of smiling that does not require a camera. There is a version of this story that would be about money, about the $500 million on the screen, about the reversal, about the powerful woman brought low by her own assumptions, and the man who turned out to be worth more than she had calculated. That version of the story is entirely true and entirely beside the point. The point is not the number. The point is never the number. The point is that Emily Brooks grew up knowing what it cost to be seen by a stranger's fast, indifferent eye, and found insufficient, and she carried that knowledge through 20 years of accumulating power, and somewhere in the carrying, she forgot which end of the glance she had started on. The point is that David Cooper, who had every reason to be sharpened by what he had lost the years of rejection, the acquisition celebrated in a Frankfurt conference room while his wife lay dying in Michigan. The 5 years of solitary mornings had somehow remained soft enough to say to a woman who had dismissed him in public, "I appreciate you saying that." The point is that the most expensive thing Emily owned was not the firm or the portfolio or the tailored charcoal blazer. It was the assumption she had carried so long it had become invisible. And the moment in that lounge when she set it down, you can measure a great many things about a person in the first seconds you see them. You can observe what they are wearing, and how they stand, and whether they seem comfortable, or uncertain, or hurried. You can note the truck they drive, and the wear on their shoes, and the way they hold their child against their side in a public space. You can look at all of that and know something. But what you know is a surface, and surfaces are real, but they are not the whole of what is there, and if you confuse the surface for the substance, you will miss again and again and again, in ways both small and consequential, the actual person standing in front of you. The wealthiest thing in that bank on that ordinary morning was not anything that appeared on any screen. It was the patience of a man who had earned the right to be angry, and chose, instead, to be present. It was the trust of a little girl who pressed herself against his ribs because it was the safest place she knew. It was the willingness of a woman who had made herself powerful through a lifetime of work to kneel on a stage floor in front of 300 people and be held by an 8-year-old, because some moments are more important than the image you have spent 20 years building. The measure of a person is not what they own, or what they have accomplished, or what the system says they are worth. It is what they do with how they have been hurt, and how they treat the person in front of them when no one is calculating the return. That is the only account that ever really matters. And it does not have a number.